Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. Imagine moving into a home where the walls don't just creak, they whisper, where every floorboard seems to carry the echo of something it shouldn't. In Villisca, Iowa, there's a house just like that, one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. To this day, it refuses to stay silent. On June 10th, 1912, the small, tight-knit town of Villisca awoke to a nightmare. 8 people, 6 of them children, had been brutally murdered inside the modest Moore family home. The weapon was an axe, swung with such violence that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. The killer, or killers, vanished without a trace. No footprints leading away, no clear motive, no confession that ever stuck. Over a century later, the Villisca Axe Murders remain unsolved. The house itself has become a dark attraction, with ghost hunters, historians and thrill-seekers all claiming the air inside feels heavier than it should. Some say the family never left. Others believe the killer's presence lingers, mocking the living from the shadows. This is more than just a murder mystery. It's the story of a town haunted not only by tragedy, but by the possibility that evil can step through your door and never be caught. Welcome to Villisca, a house that still whispers. To understand why the Villisca Axe Murders shook not only Iowa but the entire nation, you first have to know the Moores. Josiah and Sarah Moore were not the sort of people who collected enemies. Josiah was a respected businessman, a man who made a living selling farm equipment and tools. He had a calm, steady reputation, the kind of man you could trust to shake your hand and keep his word. Sarah, on the other hand, was the heart of the household. She managed the home, raised the children, and helped organize Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church. Together, they embodied the small-town American dream of the early 20th century, a family built on faith, hard work, and community. They had 4 children: Herman, 11 years old, Catherine 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul the youngest, only 5. To neighbors and friends, the Moore children were cheerful, polite, and full of the kind of energy you'd expect from kids growing up in a rural town. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, and they were deeply woven into the social fabric of Villisca. People knew them, people trusted them, and perhaps that's what makes their fate so chilling. In a town where everyone knew everyone, how could such horror happen without someone knowing the truth? On the morning of Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the family woke as usual. Sarah prepared breakfast while Josiah readied himself for church. The children dressed neatly in their Sunday best, and the family walked together to the Presbyterian Church, where Sarah had organized the Children's Day program. It was a special event, one that Sarah had put her heart into, and the Moore children were set to take part in songs, recitations and performances. It was supposed to be a day of joy, a moment of community pride. The Moores weren't alone that evening. 2 neighbor girls, Lena and Dina Stillinger, had been invited to spend the night after the Children's Day festivities. Their parents agreed, not knowing that this decision would seal their daughter's fate. By all accounts, the children laughed and played after church, their spirits light, while Josiah and Sarah mingled with fellow townsfolk before finally making the walk home. It was a warm June evening. Nothing felt out of place. No one suspected that within hours their home would turn into a crime scene so bloody that even seasoned investigators recoiled at the sight. As the evening darkened, the house on East 2nd Street grew quiet. The children settled into their rooms. The Stillinger sisters took a guest bedroom downstairs, while the Moores' children occupied their usual sleeping spaces upstairs. Josiah and Sarah retired to their room, likely tired from the long day of church activities and socializing. To anyone passing by, the house would have looked like any other, its windows dark, its occupants safe in sleep. But inside, something else was stirring. Someone, whether a stranger or a figure known to the family, had found their way into the house. Theories abound about how the killer entered. Some say he hid in the attic, waiting patiently for the family to fall asleep. Others believe he simply slipped in through an unlocked door, common in a town where people trusted one another too much to fear intruders. Either way, as the town of Villisca drifted into slumber, someone inside that house remained awake, waiting and planning. What makes the story all the more haunting is how ordinary the Moores' final hours were. There were no arguments reported, no suspicious visitors noted, no signs that anyone expected tragedy. To them, it was just another Sunday night. The children may have whispered to each other before sleep, giggling about the day's performances or imagining the adventures to come in the summer. Josiah and Sarah may have exchanged a few tired words, the contentment of a family day lingering in their thoughts. The Stillinger sisters, likely thrilled to be having a sleepover, must have fallen asleep with the excitement of youth, unaware of the shadows gathering just beyond their bedroom door. And then silence. The kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting for the first swing of the axe. Looking back, it's impossible not to feel a chill when imagining this scene. Everything was so normal, so routine. If you were to freeze time at 10 p.m. that night, you would see a family safe in their beds, the embodiment of small-town innocence. But fast forward only a few hours, and that same house would become a tomb. It's this stark contrast that still grips people today, the reminder that safety can be an illusion, and that horror can enter even the most ordinary of homes. The last day of the Moore family was full of joy, community, and love. Perhaps that's why their story continues to echo more than a century later, because when you understand who they were, the father, the mother, the children, the visiting sisters, you don't just see names on a list of victims. You see a family who laughed, lived, and trusted, until their trust was shattered in the most violent way possible. And the question remains, just as it did on that June morning, who was waiting in the shadows, and why did they choose this family, this house, and that night? It was sometime after midnight, when the silence inside the Moore house turned into something else entirely. No one knows the exact moment the killer began his work, but investigators pieced together a sequence that has haunted imaginations for more than a century. The weapon of choice was an axe, not some strange imported tool, not a weapon carried by a stranger from afar, but Josiah Moore's very own household axe, turned against the family who owned it. The killer is believed to have started in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah lay asleep. Josiah took the first blows. He was struck with such force that his face was unrecognizable, the axe falling again and again, until the bed itself bore deep gouges from the wild swings. Sarah was next, her body showing the same savage repetition. Forensic analysis, primitive as it was in 1912, suggested that Josiah was likely killed instantly, but Sarah may have lingered a moment longer, caught between sleep and nightmare. If so, her last moments were ones of terror. From there, the killer moved down the hall, where the Moore children lay. One by one he entered their rooms, raising the axe and bringing it down without mercy. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, each child struck while still in bed, most without even stirring. Some investigators believe the killer used the blunt end of the axe rather than the blade for many of the children, as though to silence them quickly without the mess of a sharp cut. But this detail only adds to the horror because it suggests thought, planning, and a strange kind of restraint within the savagery. The Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, were the last to be attacked. Their bedroom told a slightly different story. Unlike the Moores, who appeared to have been struck in their sleep, Lena seemed to have awakened. Her body was found in a position that suggested movement, perhaps a struggle. Some reports claimed defensive wounds, though others argue her position could have been coincidence. What remains clear is that her final moments were not as quiet as the others. Whether she saw her attacker's face, we will never know. By dawn, 8 people lay dead. 8 lives, extinguished in a house that, only hours before, had been filled with laughter and prayers. But the killer didn't leave immediately. Here is where the case takes on its most bizarre and haunting details. Whoever committed the murders lingered. He covered the victims' faces with sheets and clothing, as though unwilling to look at what he had done. He took pieces of food from the kitchen, suggesting a calmness in the aftermath, as if hunger had returned after the frenzy of violence. He even placed a plate of uneaten food on the table, as though mocking the normalcy of the household. And then came the strangest act of all. He draped clothing over the mirrors in the house and over the windows. Some interpret this as a ritual act, a way to block the souls of the dead from escaping, or to prevent the killer from having to confront his reflection. Others believe it was simply a paranoid attempt to keep prying eyes from seeing inside. Either way, it speaks to a disturbed mind. Someone who wasn't merely in a rush to flee but who lingered with his crime, rearranging the home of the dead. The townspeople who later entered the house described it as the most horrifying sight they had ever seen. The brutality of the murders was overwhelming, but the quiet aftermath, the covered faces, the food on the table, the obscured mirrors, was almost worse. It suggested thought, intention, perhaps even ritual. It made the murders feel less like a random act of violence, and more like something deeply personal or deeply deranged. What no one could understand was how it had all happened so silently. No neighbors reported screams. No one claimed to have heard the thunderous blows of an axe being wielded again and again. And this was a small town. Houses were close together, windows often open on warm June nights. How could 8 murders unfold in near silence? Was the killer so methodical, so precise that no one stirred long enough to cry out? Or did someone hear and choose not to speak? The scene that morning was chaotic. Curious neighbors, alerted when the family failed to appear for daily chores and visits, eventually entered the home. What they saw sent shockwaves through Villisca. The Moore's respected, beloved household was now a place of nightmares. Word spread quickly, drawing crowds to the property. In fact, so many people entered the crime scene before authorities could secure it, that valuable evidence was almost certainly lost. People picked up objects, walked through blood, and whispered rumors that would cloud the case for decades. But before any theories could be tested, before suspects could be interrogated, one chilling fact remained. Someone had entered a quiet farmhouse on a summer night and destroyed an entire family, and then walked back out into the darkness of Villisca, never to be caught. The night of June 9th into June 10th, 1912, became more than just a crime. It became a legend of horror, whispered about in Iowa and beyond. And as much as investigators tried to piece together what happened inside that house, there was always something missing, the answer to why. Why them? Why this night? And who could do such a thing, then vanish into thin air? When the morning sun rose on Villisca, that June day in 1912, no one yet knew that the town's name would soon be etched into the darkest corners of American crime history. For the first few hours, life in Villisca was ordinary. Farmers rose early, children set out on chores, and neighbors exchanged greetings across white picket fences and dusty roads. But something felt off almost immediately. The Moore's household was unusually quiet, too quiet. Josiah Moore was known to be an early riser. He had a reputation for diligence, running a successful farm supply business, and setting the example of industry in town. Sarah, too, was a visible presence, often seen in the mornings tending to her garden or preparing for church activities. But by mid-morning, there had been no sign of them. The animals in their barn remained unfed, their horses still restless in the stalls, a sharp departure from the family's usual discipline. Neighbors noticed. One of them, a close friend of the Moores, finally decided to check in. She walked to the house, knocked on the door, and when no one answered, tried the knob. Locked. That in itself was strange. In small towns like Villisca, doors were rarely bolted shut. Uncertainty quickly shifted to concern. Soon more neighbors gathered, drawn by both worry and curiosity. After repeated knocks brought no answer, one of them contacted Josiah's brother, who had a spare key. It was he who finally stepped across the threshold, leading the way into the silent farmhouse. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The air inside the Moore home was stifling, heavy with a strange metallic tang that clung to the senses. The house was still, unnervingly so. As Josiah's brother moved further in, he entered the first bedroom and froze. There, under a sheet, lay 2 small forms, the Stillinger sisters. The sight was enough to confirm the worst suspicions, and he stumbled back out of the house, his face ashen, refusing to see more. "They're all dead," he whispered to the neighbors outside, his voice trembling. It was the first time Villisca heard the words that would echo through its streets. The Moores were gone. Word spread faster than wildfire. Within minutes, neighbors, friends, and strangers crowded around the Moore home. The local marshal was called, but by the time he arrived, it was too late to preserve the sanctity of the crime scene. Dozens of townspeople, their faces pale with shock and morbid curiosity, had already entered the home. Some lifted sheets to see the victims with their own eyes. Others touched objects, peered into rooms, whispered to one another about the horror. The Moore home, which had only hours earlier been filled with warmth, was now overrun by whispers, gasps, and the trampling of boots over evidence. The marshal tried to regain control, but his authority faltered against the tidal wave of human fascination. It is said that one man even took fragments of Josiah's skull as a grisly souvenir before order was restored. In an era before strict forensic protocol, the damage to the case was immense. Crucial evidence was contaminated, altered, or lost entirely within those chaotic first hours. To investigators who later pieced together the sequence, it was like trying to read a story after half the pages had been torn out. Still, the horror was undeniable. 8 lives extinguished, entire generations, parents, children, and guests, all gone in one night. In a community as small as Villisca, the ripple effects were immediate. Church bells tolled with a mournful weight. Neighbors wept openly in the streets. Business ground to a halt, as men and women abandoned their work to gather in clusters, sharing rumors and fears. Was the killer still in town? Was this the work of a madman who might strike again? Or worse, was the murderer one of their own? The discovery shattered the town's sense of safety. In Villisca, people rarely locked their doors, trusting the familiarity of community life. But after June 10, 1912, locks clicked into place on every farmhouse and cottage. Families kept lamps burning late into the night, and children were hushed inside before dark. The ordinary rhythms of life had been violated, replaced by an undercurrent of dread. A town that once prided itself on harmony, now buzzed with paranoia. The sheriff quickly called in outside help, aware that the case was beyond the scope of small-town policing. Detectives and lawmen from neighboring counties, and eventually even from state agencies, arrived to take control. They set about interviewing anyone who might have heard or seen something unusual the night before. Yet, bizarrely, almost no one reported anything. There had been no screams, no cries for help, no sounds of struggle. The murders had unfolded in silence, as though the house itself had swallowed the horror whole. As the news spread beyond Villisca, reporters descended on the small town. Journalists from Des Moines, Chicago, and even New York filled the streets, hungry for details. The crime was unlike anything America had seen before, not just in its brutality, but in its mystery. Families slaughtered in their homes were not unheard of, but the combination of savagery, ritualistic detail, and total lack of explanation made the case irresistible to the press. Headlines called it the Villisca Horror and the Murder House Mystery. Almost overnight, Villisca was transformed from a quiet dot on the map to the center of national attention. For the Moore's relatives, the discovery was a devastation beyond words. In a single night, their family tree had been severed, branches lopped off without mercy. For Lena and Dinah Stillinger's parents, grief was equally unbearable. They had kissed their daughters goodbye for what should have been a fun sleepover, only to lose them forever in the most violent way imaginable. The communal grief was raw, visible, and suffocating, hanging over Villisca like a heavy shroud. And yet, in the middle of that grief, whispers began to spread. Some whispered about strange figures seen walking the roads late at night, others about outsiders who had been in town recently, drifters or traveling workers, and a few, more boldly, hinted that the evil might lie closer to home, that someone in Villisca itself had wielded the axe. In the days following the discovery, Villisca was no longer just a grieving town. It was a community on edge, united by sorrow but divided by suspicion. The farmhouse on the corner was no longer just the Moore residence. It had become the murder house, a place no one would walk past at night without glancing twice over their shoulder. And as investigators began to dig deeper, the case only grew stranger, more complex, and more haunting. The Villisca Axe Murders quickly grew from a local tragedy to a national obsession. Once the shock of the discovery passed, the grim reality set in 8 people were dead, and someone had to be responsible. But in a crime of such magnitude, with so little evidence preserved, the investigation was doomed almost from the start. It was 1912, decades before modern forensics, DNA testing, or even standardized crime scene management. The investigators had little more than intuition, interviews, and what remained of a contaminated scene. The first step was to examine the weapon. The axe itself was found inside the Moore house, leaning against a wall. It belonged to Josiah Moore. That detail alone baffled detectives. Why would a killer use the family's own axe, rather than bringing a weapon? Did it suggest the crime was unplanned, or was it a deliberate attempt to make the murders seem random? Bloodied and worn, the axe told only part of the story. Whoever wielded it had done so with shocking precision, striking again and again in the dead of night, leaving every person in the house brutally slaughtered. Investigators also noted strange details that defied explanation. All of the victims' faces had been covered, some with sheets, others with clothing. The mirrors in the house were draped with fabric. A piece of uncooked bacon was discovered near the crime scene, wrapped in a towel. These oddities sparked endless speculation. Was it ritualistic, the sign of a disturbed mind, or simply the behavior of someone trying to avoid facing what they had done? From the very start, the list of suspects ballooned. Almost anyone could have been the killer. In fact, over the next few years, more than a dozen different people would be seriously investigated, but the earliest suspicions fell close to home. Some pointed to Frank Jones, a wealthy Villisca businessman and Iowa state senator. Jones had once employed Josiah Moore but lost him after Moore struck out on his own and built a rival business. Adding fuel to the fire were rumors that Moore had been romantically involved with Jones's daughter-in-law. Motive? Certainly. But could an elderly statesman really have taken up an axe and slaughtered an entire family? Many doubted it. Still, the whispers never went away. Some even believed Jones may have hired a hitman to do the job for him. Others turned their suspicions toward Reverend George Kelly, a peculiar traveling preacher who had attended the Children's Day program at the Moores Church the very evening of the murders. Kelly was an unsettling figure, small in stature, socially awkward and prone to strange behavior. He had a history of mental illness and was rumored to suffer from a fascination with young girls. Witnesses reported that he left Villisca on a train in the early morning hours after the murders, which only deepened suspicions. Years later, Kelly would even confess to the crime, though his confession was riddled with contradictions and later recanted. Still, for many, the image of the eccentric preacher fit all too well. But it wasn't just locals under suspicion. Detectives soon began linking the Villisca murders to a string of eerily similar axe killings across the Midwest. Families slaughtered in their sleep, faces covered, the same ritual-like elements. The murders in Ellsworth, Kansas and Powell, Kansas, bore uncanny resemblances. Was Villisca just one act in the bloody trail of a roving serial killer? Newspapers began to spin the theory of a Midwest axeman, a figure drifting along train lines, striking towns without warning, leaving terror in his wake. The investigation itself was a circus. Pinkerton detectives arrived, hired by prominent locals desperate for answers. Amateur sleuths and fortune-tellers offered their services. Reporters fueled speculation with lurid headlines, naming suspects one day and clearing them the next. Theories ranged from coldly logical to outright bizarre. Some whispered of occult involvement, citing the covered mirrors and ritual-like details. Others believed the killer had been hiding in the Moore house for hours, maybe even days, waiting for the right moment to strike. A few insisted the murderer had to be someone the Moores trusted. How else could they have entered so quietly? The lack of clear evidence only heightened the paranoia. Villagers looked at one another differently. Neighbors began locking their doors, avoiding eye contact, wondering if the killer was walking among them. Theories bred suspicion, and suspicion bred division. Even the government grew involved. The governor of Iowa pressured officials for progress. But with each passing month, the trail grew colder. Fingerprinting existed, but it was rudimentary and rarely admissible in court. Blood typing was decades away. Witness testimony was unreliable at best, with memories shifting and rumors spreading like wildfire. Every promising lead collapsed into dead ends. In the end, investigators were left with nothing concrete. Frank Jones would never be charged, though his name was tarnished in whispers for the rest of his life. Reverend George Kelly would be arrested years later, tried twice, once acquitted, once with a hung jury. No conviction was ever secured. As for the theory of a traveling axe murderer, no suspect was ever definitively identified. The case remained, and still remains, unsolved. For the people of Villisca, the failed investigation was its own kind of horror. Not only had they lost friends and family in a single night of brutality, but now they were left with no justice, no answers, and no closure. Each suspect raised hope that the nightmare might end, only for those hopes to collapse in disappointment. The Moore house, once the site of warmth and community, now stood as a monument to failure, a silent reminder that the killer had not been found. To this day, the Villisca Axe Murders linger as one of America's most infamous cold cases, not because of what is known, but because of everything that remains unanswered. By the time suspects were hauled into court, the Villisca Axe Murders had already transformed into a nationwide obsession. Newspapers from coast to coast plastered lurid headlines about the slaughtered Moore family. Reporters painted the quiet Iowa town as a place forever cursed, a community haunted by the shadow of an unknown killer. And in an era before radio or television, newspapers were the great stage of public imagination. Villisca was no longer just a tragedy. It was entertainment, fear and spectacle rolled into one. The first major trial centered on Reverend George Kelly, the strange itinerant preacher who seemed tailor-made for headlines. Kelly's odd behavior, including writing letters to women across Iowa and boasting about the murders, made him an irresistible target. Detectives leaned heavily on a confession he gave in 1917, 5 years after the murders, when he admitted to entering the Moore home and wielding the axe. But the confession was shaky at best. It contradicted physical evidence, lacked clear motive, and seemed to shift each time Kelly retold it. In court, the defense argued that Kelly was mentally unstable and easily coerced. They pointed out that his confession was obtained after long, grueling interrogations. Witnesses described him as a man desperate for attention, someone who might confess simply to be in the spotlight. The first trial ended in a hung jury. In the second, Kelly was outright acquitted. The verdict sent shockwaves through Iowa. Many believed he was guilty, but without solid evidence, conviction was impossible. The law required proof, and proof was the one thing Villisca had never found. Frank Jones, the wealthy state senator, was also whispered about in hushed tones, though he never faced trial. His political power and reputation shielded him from formal charges, but the suspicion never left. Some locals believed he had hired a hitman, possibly William Mansfield, a man suspected in other axe murders across the Midwest. Mansfield was brought before a grand jury, but the case collapsed for lack of evidence. Over time, these accusations faded into rumor, but never truly died. While the courtroom failed to deliver justice, the media turned Villisca into a gothic melodrama. Papers printed sensational details. The bacon at the crime scene, the draped mirrors, the faces of victims hidden under sheets. Each detail was exaggerated until it became folklore. Cartoonists drew grim illustrations of shadowy killers lurking in cornfields. Feature writers spun theories that read more like pulp detective novels than journalism. Villisca, once just another farming town, was cemented in the national imagination as a place of terror. The circus atmosphere came at a cost. Villagers who had once trusted each other now eyed neighbors with suspicion. Families feuded. Gossip became as dangerous as evidence. Anyone eccentric, reclusive, or unlucky enough to cross public suspicion risked being branded a killer. The fear that gripped Villisca did not fade after the trials ended. It deepened. Parents warned children not to wander at night. Doors that had once stayed open in daylight were locked tight. The very identity of the town was reshaped by fear. The trials also underscored a harsh truth. The law of 1912 simply could not keep pace with the brutality of the crime. Forensics were primitive. Blood analysis was nearly useless. Fingerprinting was barely trusted. Investigators had no modern methods to link suspects to the scene. Every lead collapsed into speculation, and in the vacuum of answers, conspiracy theories grew wild. Some believed a cult had committed the murders. Others thought a vagrant passing through town snapped in a fit of madness. Still others were convinced the killer was someone who had lived quietly among them the entire time. As the years dragged on, the case grew colder, but never truly closed. Villisca could not escape its identity. The Moore house itself became a kind of morbid symbol. Children dared each other to run past it at night. Adults crossed the street rather than walk near it. The home, once filled with laughter, was now a monument to horror. In time, it became infamous. And decades later, it would be restored as a tourist attraction, marketed as one of America's most haunted houses. But in 1912, 1917, and even into the 1920s, it was simply a scar on the town. The legacy of fear extended beyond Villisca. The murders became shorthand for vulnerability in small-town America. The idea that such horror could strike in a place as ordinary as Villisca shattered illusions of safety. It was no longer possible to say, that couldn't happen here, because it had, and the killer had never been found. Journalists eventually moved on to other stories, but in Villisca, the nightmare remained. Families of the victims grew old without answers. Townsfolk carried the suspicion and the stigma for generations. The Moore children never had the chance to grow up, their laughter replaced with silence and whispers, and the farmhouse, still standing, kept its secrets, as if the walls themselves refused to tell the truth. The Villisca Axe Murders, despite all the trials, all the headlines, and all the theories, ended in silence. No killer was ever named with certainty, no justice was ever delivered. What was left was a legend, one that blurred fact, rumor, and folklore, until no one could tell where truth ended and myth began. As decades passed, the Moore home became more than just a place where tragedy had occurred. It became a character in the story itself. The murders had left such a deep scar on Villisca that even after families moved in and out of the house, no one could live there without sensing the weight of what had happened within its walls. To outsiders, it was just another farmhouse. To the people of Villisca, it was a house that would not let go of its secrets. Whispers of hauntings began almost immediately after the murders. Children claimed they heard cries at night when they dared each other to sneak near the property. Some said they saw flickers of lantern light moving from room to room when the house was supposed to be empty. For townsfolk already burdened with fear, It was easier to believe that the house was haunted than to face the harsher reality that a killer had walked free and might return. By the 1920s and 1930s, ghost stories about the house had spread far beyond Villisca. Travelers passing through would stop just to catch a glimpse of the Axe Murder house. Neighbors told tales of footsteps echoing in the night, objects moving on their own, or doors swinging shut as if pushed by invisible hands. The most common rumor was that you could hear children's laughter, faint but chilling, floating out of the upstairs bedrooms where the Moore children had been slain. For the families who tried to live there, the house was a burden. Some left within months, others stayed longer, but admitted unease they could never shake. Tenants reported vivid nightmares, sudden chills, and the constant sense of being watched. A few swore they saw shadowy figures at the end of hallways. Even those who dismissed the supernatural admitted the house carried a suffocating heaviness. Living in a place where so much blood had been spilled was simply unbearable. The reputation of the house only grew with time. By the late 20th century, Villisca embraced the notoriety. The Moore home was restored to appear, as it had in 1912, simple, rustic, eerily ordinary. No plumbing, no electricity, just wooden floors and faded wallpaper. Tourists could now step inside and feel the same oppressive silence that greeted the Moores on their final night. The restoration was both a memorial and a business. Guided tours, late-night ghost hunts, and paranormal investigations became a draw for curiosity seekers across the country. And the paranormal activity? Reports exploded. Investigators recorded strange audio, children's voices, disembodied whispers, unexplained thuds. Photographs taken inside showed eerie light streaks or orbs hovering in the air. Some visitors fainted. Others claimed they were scratched or pushed by unseen forces. The kitchen, where the axe may have been discarded, became infamous for sudden cold spots. The upstairs bedrooms where the children slept were said to be the most active, filled with inexplicable noises and shadows darting just out of sight. Perhaps the most chilling accounts came from those who stayed overnight. The Villisca Axe Murder house began offering overnight stays, and brave or reckless guests would bring sleeping bags, cameras and recorders. Many reported waking up at precisely 2 a.m., the estimated time of the murders, to the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs. Some heard a faint thud, like an axe striking wood. Others swore they heard children crying. Even skeptics admitted the house had an atmosphere unlike anywhere else. The home became a staple of paranormal television. Shows like Ghost Adventures and Most Terrifying Places in America filmed episodes there, cementing its reputation as one of the most haunted houses in the United States. With each broadcast, the legend of Villisca grew, drawing ghost hunters, true crime fans, and thrill seekers from across the world. But beneath the ghost stories lies a deeper truth. The house is haunted not only by spirits, but by the unsolved mystery itself. The lack of justice, the silence of unanswered questions, and the brutality of the crime all linger in the air. Visitors aren't just confronting the possibility of ghosts, they're confronting the unsettling fact that human beings are capable of unimaginable violence, and sometimes the guilty are never caught. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder house is both a tourist attraction and a memorial. People come to gawk, to thrill, to fear, but also to remember. The Moore family, and the Stillinger girls who died with them, are not forgotten. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper in the dark, is a reminder that history never fully dies. The house stands as proof that some places carry memory like a wound, refusing to fade. The afterlife of Villisca is not just about ghosts. It's about America's obsession with unsolved mysteries. The case symbolizes everything chilling about the unknown, the randomness of violence, the failures of justice and the stories that refuse to end. Whether you believe in spirits or not, one thing is undeniable. Step into the house, and you feel something. Maybe it's the weight of tragedy. Maybe it's your imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, the house is still whispering its secrets, waiting for someone to finally listen. More than a century has passed since that June night in 1912, yet the Villisca Axe murders remain as vivid in the American imagination as the day they occurred. The story is not just about a brutal crime, it's about the unsettling truths it exposes, about fear, about justice, and about memory. When the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters went to bed, they could not have imagined that by morning their home would become a crime scene that echoed across generations. The brutality of the killings shocked the town, but it was the aftermath that ensured Villisca would never fade from history. Investigations failed, suspects were paraded and discarded, and theories multiplied like weeds. In the end, no one was ever held accountable, and that is where the power of the story lies, in its incompleteness. An unsolved case is like an unfinished sentence. It demands that we fill the silence with our own imagination. That's why the Villisca murders have outlived the details of other crimes from the same era. They're not just facts in a file, they're a riddle that continues to taunt us. Was it Reverend Kelly, the odd preacher with violent impulses? Was it someone in town harboring a secret vendetta? Or was it a stranger who passed through and vanished forever? The uncertainty is both maddening and magnetic. The house itself deepens the story. Unlike many crime scenes that were eventually demolished, the Moore home still stands. To walk through its doors is to walk back in time, into rooms where laughter once rang out, and where horror left its mark. The stillness is oppressive, as if the walls themselves remember. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there is no denying the psychological weight of being in a place where life was so brutally taken. What makes Villisca even more haunting is how ordinary it all seems. A small farmhouse, a close-knit town, a family living their lives, and then, in one night, everything was shattered. It could have been any family, in any town. That ordinariness is what makes the crime so chilling. Evil did not announce itself with fanfare. It slipped quietly into a home and destroyed it from within. The fascination with Villisca tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the crime. We are drawn to mysteries, especially the ones that refuse to close. We want answers, we want closure, but Villisca gives us neither. Instead, it forces us to sit with uncertainty, and in doing so, it mirrors the uncertainties of life itself. We don't always get explanations. Sometimes terrible things happen, and we're left with nothing but fragments of evidence and an ache for what can never be resolved. Yet, in a strange way, Villisca has become more than tragedy. It is now a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the macabre, the mysterious, and the unknown. People come not just for ghost hunts or morbid curiosity, but to connect with a story that has endured through time. Each visitor, whether they leave believing in spirits or not, becomes part of the living memory of the case. The legacy of Villisca is this: the past never truly dies. It lingers, whispering in empty hallways, flickering in half-forgotten records, surfacing in the imagination of anyone who dares to listen. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters are gone, but their story endures, retold in books, in documentaries, in the nervous laughter of ghost hunters who hear a creak on the stairs at 2 a.m. Villisca is more than a murder case. It is a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears of violence, of injustice, of mysteries that remain unsolved. And as long as those fears remain part of the human condition, the story of the Villisca Axe Murders will never fade. Because in the end, it's not just the house that whispers, it's history itself, reminding us that some doors, once opened, never fully close.